Nomophobia, the fear of being without your phone. Most people watching this will recognize at least 3 of these in themselves, and this is usually the first one they find. It is also the cleanest example there is of how these words get built, because nomophobia is not Greek at all. It did not come from a clinic or a journal. It came from the British Post Office, which commissioned YouGov to run a survey on mobile phone anxiety in 2008. The word is an abbreviation of no mobile phone phobia. They asked around 2,000 people and reported that 53% felt anxious when they lost their phone or ran out of battery. That is a press release. A postal service ran a marketing exercise and named the disorder in the process, and it worked well enough that nomophobia now has systematic reviews in psychology journals and validated questionnaires built to measure it. The underlying thing is not nothing. Researchers who study it tend to describe it as an anxiety pattern rather than a phobia, because the fear is about being cut off rather than about the object in your hand. The word outran the evidence by more than a decade, and the evidence has been chasing it ever since. Megalophobia, large things. Statues and cruise ships and wind turbines, or the underside of a bridge. This one is about scale, and it overlaps with deep water so often that somebody built a compound word for the overlap. Thalassophobia, meaning large things in deep water. That word tells you how this vocabulary actually gets made. Nobody discovered Thalassophobia in a study somebody stacked 3 Greek roots together, because a caption needed filling. Megalophobia itself lands in the manual's 5th box, the one labeled Other, which is where every fear goes that does not fit the 4 named categories. And the honest position is that size is rarely the whole story. What people describe as being near something whose scale their body cannot process, which reads much more like a threat response than like a reaction to dimensions. The cost is quiet until the trigger is structural. Somebody who cannot stand under a bridge support does not have a preference. They have a map with holes in it. Somniphobia, the fear of falling asleep. And this is not insomnia, which is the mistake almost everybody makes with it. An insomniac wants to sleep and cannot. Somebody with somniphobia is refusing because of what sleep means to them. Losing control, not waking up. Being unguarded while something happens in the room. The strongest predictor is a history of parasomnia, which covers nightmares and sleep paralysis and the other things that happen at the edge of sleep, and it appears heavily in people with PTSD. Here's what makes it different from everything else here. Avoidance is the standard move against a phobia, and with most triggers, avoidance works at a price. Avoid sleep, and you do not get relief. You get sleep deprivation, which makes the nightmares worse, and the paralysis more likely, which makes the original fear look more reasonable. The avoidance manufactures its own evidence. That loop is why the first-line treatment is not exposure to a frightening object. It is cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia, aimed at the loop rather than at the fear. Chronophobia, the fear of time passing. This has a stranger origin than any of the others, because it was not first described in a clinic, it was described in a prison. In 1944, the psychologist Salvatore Russo documented it among inmates at Auburn Prison in New York, and the name he used was prison neurosis. What he was looking at was people who had become fixated on duration itself, time crawling or suddenly running out, counting down days and panicking at the size of what was left of a sentence. And this is the only fear here with no available exit. Every other phobia has an object you can put distance between yourself and. You can leave the water, put the phone down, refuse the party. Nobody has ever avoided time, which is why it surfaces in situations people cannot walk out of, and why the version described today usually shows up in someone facing aging or a diagnosis rather than a sentence. Trypophobia. You have seen the pictures. Clusters of small holes packed tight together, a lotus seed pod or a honeycomb or a sponge, and something in your chest tightens without asking you first. Here's what almost nobody says about it. Trypophobia is not in the DSM-5. It is not a diagnosis, and it never has been. The word was coined online rather than in a clinic, and the first peer-reviewed description came years later when Cole and Wilkins published on it in 2013 and estimated that around 15% of adults react to those images. Later work using samples of more than 2,000 people widened that to somewhere between 10 and 18%. So the reaction is real, and it is common, and it is still not a disorder. The explanation they offered is that the clusters share a visual signature with genuinely dangerous things like the skin of a venomous animal or the marks of infectious disease. And there is newer work from Cole's own group pointing somewhere less comfortable. A good part of the response may be socially learned, spread by seeing the images and being told what they are supposed to mean, which would make this the one fear here that the internet may have helped manufacture. Thalassophobia. Deep water, not drowning and not sharks, but the vastness itself and the distance between your feet and the bottom. This one is also missing from the manual. Search the DSM-5 for the word thalassophobia and you will not find it anywhere. But unlike the last one, there is a box it drops into cleanly. Clinicians diagnose it as specific phobia, natural environment type. The manual recognizes exactly 5 subtypes, and they are broader than the vocabulary suggests. Animal fears and natural environment fears sit at the top, then blood injection injury, then situational, and then a 5th box labeled Other. That is the entire official taxonomy. Every Greek word you have ever seen attached to a fear is somebody's label for a case that already sits inside one of those 5 boxes. And natural environment is the biggest box of the 5, running somewhere between 9 and 12% of people. So Thalassophobia is common and real, and its name is a folk name for the most crowded category in the book. The cost is that you cannot arrange your life around avoiding it the way you can with an animal. You can go your whole life without meeting a snake. You cannot look at a map without meeting the ocean. Globophobia, balloons. And the first thing to understand is that most people who have it are not afraid of the balloon. They are afraid of the bang. The trigger is the burst, which makes it closer to a fear of sudden sound than a fear of an object. And that changes what avoidance has to look like. You cannot watch the balloon and stay safe, because the entire problem is not knowing when. A case report in the British Medical Journal in 2013 described people building their lives around it, avoiding parties and weddings and work events where balloons might turn up. Oprah Winfrey has talked about hers in public and said the sound reminds her of gunfire. That detail is worth sitting with because it points at what a lot of these actually are underneath. Not a strange fear of a harmless object, but an ordinary fear of a dangerous. One wired to the wrong trigger, and there is one coming that runs on exactly that mechanism, turned all the way inward. Emetophobia, the fear of vomiting, either your own or somebody else's. And this is where the pattern turns over. The famous names so far have had thin clinical records behind them. This one has an obscure name and a very thick one. Emetophobia sits under that 5th category in the manual, and it has been studied for decades. A meta-analysis puts the point prevalence at around 5%, with lifetime figures near 6 to 7% in women and 2 to 3% in men. About 91% of the people in those studies are women. It starts early, with a mean onset around 9 years old, and then there is the number that should stop you. The average gap between onset and seeking treatment is roughly 25 years. People carry this out of primary school and into middle age before anyone treats it. There is also research indicating that among people who actually turn up for treatment of a specific phobia, this is the most common. One they arrive with. The most clinically present fear here is the one with the name you had never heard. Koumpounophobia, buttons. The ones on a shirt? Estimates put it under 1% of people, which makes it rare in the real sense rather than rare in the way a thumbnail means it. And it has one of the best documented case files in the whole category. In 2002, Saavedra and Silverman published a case study in the Journal of the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry on a 9-year-old boy. What they found was that the engine was not fear, it was disgust. He traced it back to an incident in kindergarten involving a bowl of buttons, and what he described was much closer to contamination than to danger. They built an exposure program around that reading, using a distress scale from 0 to 8 that the boy helped design himself, and by the end of it, he no longer met the criteria for the phobia. The most famous case is not in any journal. Steve Jobs disliked buttons, wore turtlenecks, and pushed hard against physical buttons on hardware. Whether that had anything to do with the touchscreen is speculation that gets repeated as fact, and nobody has ever demonstrated it. Phobophobia, the fear of fear. And it sounds like wordplay until you see what it actually describes, which is not a fear of the idea of being afraid, it is a fear of the physical sensations. The racing heart and the tight chest and the shortness of breath, and then the hands going cold and strange. Somebody with this reads those signals as evidence that something is seriously wrong with their body, and that reading produces more of the same signals. Clinically, it sits very close to what researchers call anxiety sensitivity, and that is one of the best studied mechanisms in the entire field because it runs underneath panic disorder. A panic attack is usually not caused by anything in the room. It is caused by the body noticing its own alarm and treating the alarm itself as the emergency, which is why this one is the strangest of all of them. Every fear before it needed an object. This one runs without one. It takes the machinery all the others use and aims it at itself, and it will keep running in an empty room. Trypanophobia, needles. And this is the only one here whose own name is one of the manual's 5 boxes. Blood injection injury was the 3rd of them, and it is the only box named after a procedure rather than a kind of thing. The full phobia runs at about 3.5% of adults, with a median onset around 5.5 years old. Ordinary needle fear is much wider than that, and a meta-analysis of 119 studies put it at 20 to 50% of adolescents. But the box exists for a physiological reason. Every other fear here speeds the body up, and this one changes its mind halfway through. Your heart rate and blood pressure climb the way they do in any panic, and then they crash, and the blood drains out of your head and you go down. Around 75% of people with it report a history of fainting, which no other phobia does. That inverts the treatment as well. The first line technique is applied tension, which means clenching your muscles hard on purpose to drive your blood pressure back up. It is the only phobia in the book treated by making the body more aroused rather than less. And it is not harmless. In a survey of 15,000 British adults, injection fear accounted for roughly a tenth of all vaccine hesitancy. That is a proper Greek name and a proper clinical file and a measurable cost, all attached to the same fear. The last one has none of those things. Coulrophobia, clowns. And if Nomophobia came from a post office, this one came from nobody at all. The word starts turning up on internet lists of phobias in the late 1990s with no paper and no clinician anywhere behind it. The Greek root is not really Greek either. The usual suggestion is a word for stilt walker that survives in a single ancient lexicon, and it sits too far from Coulro to work. The Oxford English Dictionary added the entry anyway in 2020, and then the research turned up and found something real underneath it. A team at the University of South Wales surveyed 987 people across 64 countries, and 53.5% reported some degree of fear of clowns. They went back to the 528 who did and ranked 8 possible origins for it. Here is the part almost nobody guesses. Having actually been frightened by a clown finished last of the 8. Horror films came second. The top answer was that the makeup hides the face so you cannot read what the person underneath it is feeling or about to do, which means this is not really a fear of clowns, it is a fear of not being able to tell what is coming. What separates these is not how strange the fear is. Trypophobia and Coulrophobia and Nomophobia were named by the internet and by a post office. Emetophobia and Chronophobia and Trypanophobia were named by clinicians writing down what was in front of them. A Greek word is not a diagnosis, and having a name for something is not the same as that thing being a condition. What decides it is not the object at all. It is whether the fear is severe enough and persistent enough, and whether you have started building your life around not meeting it. Avoidance is the line. Everything on the other side of it is just something you do not like. If you made it to the end, comment fearless, so I know who got through all 12 of these without looking away.